The late 1950s were a time when television could make an ordinary teenager into a household name overnight. Millions of young Americans hurried home after school, switched on their black and white sets, and let American Bandstand flood their living rooms with music, laughter, and the rhythm of a new generation. Among the faces that appeared on screen in those years was Frankie Lobis, not the most talked-about dancer, not the star of every magazine cover, but a presence that quietly lingered in the memories of those who watched. His dark hair, his polite smile, and his effortless steps with partners like Peggy Leonard or JoAnn MonteCarlo made him the kind of boy next door audiences could recognize as one of their own. Yet, as the music played on, Frankie's story seemed to vanish from the spotlight. How could someone who once shared the dance floor with America fade so quickly into silence? Frankie Lobis was born in 1940, a child of Philadelphia's post-war neighborhoods where row houses lined the streets and the rhythm of daily life echoed with optimism. His family, like so many others, embraced the values of hard work and community, nurturing their children during an era when America was redefining itself after the hardships of World War II. The Lobis household carried the ordinary warmth of mid-century Philadelphia, where radio sets buzzed with the latest hits, and teenagers first felt the stirrings of independence that would soon blossom into a cultural revolution. As a boy, Frankie was known for his easygoing nature. Friends recalled a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence, someone who wasn't necessarily the loudest in the room, but could always draw attention once the music started. At school, he blended academics with the growing distractions of rock and roll, often sneaking time to practice the latest steps that were sweeping dance halls across the city. His shoes wore thin from repetition, proof of a passion that was slowly carving its own path. Philadelphia in the early 1950s was fertile ground for a teenager like Frankie. The city's local clubs, record shops, and school dances offered a glimpse into a world bigger than the corner he grew up on. Music was no longer just background noise, it was a declaration of identity, and Frankie embraced it wholeheartedly. At home, family gatherings were filled with chatter and song, and while his parents encouraged responsibility, they could not ignore the spark their son carried whenever a beat came through the radio. By the mid-teen years, Frankie had already developed the poise of a natural dancer. It wasn't about fame or recognition then. It was simply the joy of moving to the rhythms that defined his generation. What neither he nor his family could foresee was how that joy would soon connect him with millions of Americans through a television screen. For many Philadelphia teenagers in the late 1950s, American Bandstand was more than just a television show. It was the dream of being seen, of stepping onto a stage where the music of their lives played daily. Frankie Lobis first heard about the program like countless others through whispers at school and the hum of radios tuned to WFIL. Friends talked about the line forming outside Studio B, where eager teens hoped for a chance to dance before the cameras. Frankie, curious and ready, decided to try. That first walk toward the studio was unforgettable. The building on Market Street pulsed with energy. A line of teenagers stretched along the sidewalk, their chatter blending with the faint rhythm of rock and roll leaking from inside. Frankie stood among them, wearing the neat clothes of a South Philly boy, hair combed back, heart pounding with anticipation. He wasn't sure if he would make it onto the floor, but he knew he belonged in that atmosphere. When the studio doors finally opened, the scene inside was dazzling. Bright lights illuminated the dance floor, cameras rolled from their towering mounts, and Dick Clark's calm voice carried authority over the room. For a teenager like Frankie, it was both overwhelming and exhilarating. He wasn't just a boy from Philadelphia anymore. He was part of a spectacle that reached across the country. His first dances on television were tentative, yet the steps came naturally. Frankie moved with a balance of ease and discipline, the product of hours spent practicing in his neighborhood. Soon he found himself paired with dancers like Peggy Leonard, later remembered in photographs, and with JoAnn MonteCarlo, with whom he placed third in the Cha-Cha contest of 1958. It was a triumph that gave him credibility not only on the floor, but in the hearts of viewers who admired the shy yet talented boy. For Frankie, those moments were more than fleeting appearances. They were the threshold to something larger. The boy who had once danced in living rooms now danced before America, every step echoing into homes from coast to coast. By 1957 and 1958, Frankie Lobis had become a familiar face to the faithful audience of American Bandstand. He might not have commanded the same spotlight as headline couples like Justine Corelli and Bob Clayton, but his presence was undeniable. To viewers, Frankie embodied the quiet charm of the neighborhood boy next door, someone who danced not for fame, but for the pure joy of the rhythm. That authenticity was his magic. Each afternoon, as the cameras scanned across the dance floor, Frankie could be spotted moving gracefully among the crowd. His style was clean and understated, marked by confidence rather than showmanship. He had the poise of someone who respected the music, letting the beat guide him without ever overshadowing his partner. This quality made him versatile, able to dance comfortably with different partners, including Peggy Leonard, with whom he was photographed in Bandstand's early years. Fans began to notice his adaptability, a rare strength in a program where many dancers relied on fixed pairings. The turning point came in 1958 when Frankie and JoAnn MonteCarlo entered a cha-cha contest. Against stiff competition, the pair impressed judges and audiences alike, ultimately finishing in third place. It wasn't just the ranking that mattered. It was the recognition of Frankie's skill, his ability to shine under pressure, and the validation that he was more than just another teenager on the floor. His modest smile that day was remembered by those who followed the show closely, an image that captured the essence of his bandstand journey. Off the floor, Frankie became part of the program's social heartbeat. Along with friends like Larry Brumbach, Joe Fusco, and Lenny Natali, he was seen at local gatherings and even at summer outings, such as the Atlantic City trip, where Arlene Sullivan once recalled posing in a photo with Frankie and Joe Wysert. These moments blurred the line between television and real life, showing that the bandstand regulars were not distant stars, but real kids, sharing friendships, rivalries, and laughter. For the audience at home, Frankie Lobis came to represent the kind of teen they could easily know: courteous, stylish, devoted to the music, and yet still grounded in everyday life. In a decade when America was enthralled by the spectacle of television idols, Frankie's appeal was quieter, but it resonated all the same. While some dancers on American Bandstand became famous for their romantic pairings, Frankie Lobis carved a different niche. His gift was versatility. He could dance gracefully with nearly anyone. Viewers often saw him with Peggy Leonard, her bright smile matching his composed steps, a pairing that seemed effortless. Other times, he partnered with JoAnn MonteCarlo, the same partner who helped him earn third place in the 1958 Cha-Cha contest. Each partnership showcased not only Frankie's skill, but also his ability to adapt and support, making his partners shine as much as himself. In the world behind the cameras, Frankie blended seamlessly into the camaraderie of the bandstand crowd. Friends remembered him as part of a lively circle that included Larry Brumbach, Joe Fusco, and Lenny Natali. Together, they were teenagers enjoying a surreal experience. Weekdays spent under television lights, weekends filled with music, laughter, and occasional trips like the Atlantic City outing where Frankie was captured in a photo beside Arlene Sullivan and Joe Wysert. Such snapshots became treasured keepsakes, reminders that these were not professional performers, but local kids thrust into national memory. The atmosphere inside Studio B was both exhilarating and demanding. Rules were strict: no chewing gum, no suggestive movements, always maintain a wholesome image. For dancers like Frankie, the challenge was to stay natural under the scrutiny of cameras and producers. Yet he managed it with ease, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that fit the bandstand ideal. His respectful demeanor earned him trust with both fellow dancers and the audience, who saw him as approachable and genuine. What made Frankie memorable was not dramatic flair, but the small, authentic details, the way he steadied a partner's hand, the soft grin after a song ended, the calm presence he brought to the floor. Fans wrote letters to dancers like Justine and Arlene, but they also remembered Frankie, the young man who seemed to represent the dependable charm of American youth. On a program dominated by stars, his role was more subtle, yet it created a lasting impression. He may not have been the face on magazine covers, but for those who watched closely, Frankie Lobis was an essential thread in the tapestry of bandstand's golden years. As the 1960s dawned, the shine of American Bandstand began to shift. The show remained popular, but many of its early regulars were moving on with their lives. For Frankie Lobis, the pressures of balancing school, family expectations, and the growing demands of appearing on television gradually led him to reconsider his future. Unlike some dancers who sought careers in entertainment, Frankie's personality leaned toward modesty and normalcy. The bright lights of Studio B, once thrilling, became a reminder that life outside the cameras still demanded attention. There were subtle signs of change. Contest victories and television appearances had given Frankie recognition, but they did not guarantee stability. College, work, and responsibilities loomed larger with each passing year. While his friends navigated their own crossroads, some pursuing show business, others starting families, Frankie quietly stepped away from the regular routines of Bandstand. For many viewers, it was as if he simply faded from the dance floor, his absence unexplained but felt. The decision to leave was not dramatic, but it was profound. For a young man who had been part of one of television's most iconic cultural stages, stepping away meant surrendering a kind of immortality. Yet Frankie seemed to embrace the transition with dignity. He returned to Philadelphia's everyday rhythm, away from the scrutiny of the cameras, where life was defined less by applause and more by the quiet pursuit of work, friendships, and family ties. In hindsight, the turning point was not only personal, but also symbolic. Frankie represented the countless teenagers who brushed briefly against fame during the Bandstand years, only to choose ordinary life instead. The very thing that made him appealing on screen, his sincerity and grounded presence, also guided him beyond the program. For fans who remembered him, there was a bittersweet recognition. The boy they once watched every afternoon had chosen a path they could no longer follow on television. It was a choice that carried him into adulthood, toward a destiny that would later be marked by his passing in 1986 at only 46 years old. The dance floor was left behind, but the crossroads defined who Frankie Lobis would ultimately become. When Frankie Lobis stepped away from American Bandstand, he returned to the life of an ordinary Philadelphian, far from the attention of television cameras. The glow of the studio lights was replaced with the quiet routines of work, family, and community. Unlike some of his fellow dancers who pursued careers in entertainment or remained in the public eye, Frankie chose privacy, a decision that made his later years more difficult to trace, but also more human. He was no longer a teen idol dancing on national television. He was a young man carving out a path in the real world. Friends from the Bandstand years recalled that Frankie carried the same qualities into adulthood that he had shown on the floor: kindness, steadiness, and a willingness to support those around him. While the specifics of his career are less documented, what is clear is that he built his life within the familiar streets of Pennsylvania. His name surfaced in fragments, a mention here, a photograph there, an entry in reunion memories, evidence that even if he no longer danced for millions, he remained present in the memories of those who knew him personally. Life after Bandstand was not about fame, but about grounding. In community ties, in friendships that extended beyond the show, Frankie found his balance. The Atlantic City photograph with Arlene Sullivan and Joe Wysert, preserved decades later, symbolized that continuity. Bandstand may have been a chapter, but the friendships formed there carried forward. For many regulars, those bonds proved more enduring than the fleeting fame of television. Frankie's journey reached an early end in 1986, when he passed away at the age of 46. His grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, marks the resting place of a dancer once seen by millions, now remembered quietly by family, friends, and devoted fans. To those who watched Bandstand in the late 1950s, the memory of his calm smile and graceful steps lingers. His life after Bandstand may not have been lived in the spotlight, but it carried the same understated dignity that defined him on screen. Frankie Lobis may not have been the most famous name to emerge from American Bandstand, yet his legacy rests in the subtler places where memory endures. He represented the ordinary teenager elevated by television, a reminder that the show's magic was not only in its stars, but in the many faces that filled the dance floor. Frankie's smile, his steady steps, and his warmth with partners like Peggy Leonard or JoAnn MonteCarlo captured the spirit of an era when music and movement defined youth. For fans who tuned in every afternoon, his presence is still part of the collective memory of Bandstand's golden years. Though his life after the show ended too soon in 1986, the fact that he is remembered at all speaks to the impression he left. Were you one of those who remember seeing Frankie Lobis on your screen? What song, what moment brings him back to life in your memory? Share your story with us.